Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a short story that I read recently, one that is about hurricanes and something else, I guess. It's not really clear. I am referring to God's Gonna Trouble the Water, or Where is Marisol, by Randall Kenan, which was published in his short story collection If I Had Two Wings, which was published in 2020. For those who don't know, Randall Kenan is an American author, a Black American author, known for writing Southern literature about the experience of people, of especially Black individuals from the South. You see that a little bit in the book that I'm going to be talking about here, but it's also part of the older books that he's written going back to the 90s. He also wrote about the experience of LGBTQA individuals, which is significant because he was gay, so maybe writing a little bit about his own experience. He wrote a number of books and short stories and whatnot. But unfortunately, he died in 2020. If I had to guess, it was probably due to COVID, although I don't have any proof of that. I found this book at my local library. Don't forget to patronize your local libraries. They might have fun and interesting books or stuff that you struggle with, unfortunately, like the book that or the short story collection that I'm talking about here today. So without further ado, let's talk about God's Gonna Trouble the Water. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So God's Gonna Trouble the Water focuses on Mrs. Streeter. She's a bit of an older woman on vacation with her family in Barbados, and at the start of the story, they are being chased by screeching monkeys, able to get back to their hotel before they're assaulted by the monkeys. But when they get to the hotel, they learn that there are two hurricanes forming in the Atlantic. One is heading for Barbados, and the other is heading for North Carolina in the general area where Mrs. Streeter lives. She wants to get back to North Carolina, but the storms are preventing her from doing so. And after the storms come and go, what's left is a flooding region of North Carolina that makes it harder to get into that area as well. So there's just a lot of general delays and whatnot. Mrs. Streeter is also thinking about her in-home aide hired by her son, Marisol, and she's just wondering how things are going for her. But when she gets back to America in North Carolina, she finds that her home is somewhat wrecked. The foundation is still there, but when she gets inside, her food has gone bad because the power has gone out. And she had a pretty sizable garden where all the food all the plants have rotted because they were underwater and whatnot, and so they drowned there. So things are pretty stressful for Mrs. Streeter. But she goes to a local Mexican restaurant inquiring about where Marisol has been, because Marisol is Mexican too. Nobody quite knows. Meanwhile, the community rebuilds, and it appears that things are going to be pretty good. Like things are getting better for everyone, and Mrs. Streeter is able to go on with her life. A short while later, she receives a letter in the mail from one of Marisol's friends indicating that during the hurricane, Marisol's daughter died, and she went back to Mexico, where a local gang kidnapped a family member, but they couldn't pay the ransom, and then they too went missing as well, suggesting that something bad happened to Marisol. But the letter doesn't offer any comfort as to what further happened to her. And as the story comes to a close, Mrs. Streeter has some dreams of some family members who might have died, and she also considers pork chops as well, which might be in connection with one of the Mexican restaurants, given that she really likes the pork chops that they offer. And that's really where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, unfortunately, God's Gonna Trouble the Water isn't a very good short story. But I know it's weird to highlight a specifically bad short story on this channel, which I do every so often, just because it's impossible to avoid. But you need to talk about the bad in order to be able to highlight why the good are really good. But I guess one of the themes that Kenan is talking about here is the persistence of community, the ability for this sort of black community to rebound, or this mixed race community to rebound in the wake of something destructive like a hurricane. But I have a feeling that if that was the main idea of the short story, there'd be a little bit more to it, because it just kind of casually mentioned, and although things are kind of bad for Mrs. Streeter when she gets home, it doesn't seem to have a long-lasting impact on her or her family. And the community also doesn't seem to have too many struggles. So although that's an element of this story, it doesn't appear to be the focus, and Kenan doesn't really go into too much detail to highlight that aspect of the story. Kenan also raises maybe a question inadvertently about Mrs. Streeter and Marisol's relationship. Does she care about Marisol? Is that even what this is about? I'm not really clear, but you have to wonder, because she is interested in finding out where Marisol is. She goes to the local Mexican restaurant that Marisol is connected with, and finds out that she hasn't been there in a while. And later she receives a letter that says Marisol has gone missing and might be even presumed dead. And from there, all Mrs. Streeter really cares about, she has a dream, and she thinks of pork chops, which are a connecting item between Marisol and Mrs. Streeter, because Mrs. Streeter really enjoyed the pork chops from this particular Mexican restaurant. So a sort of cultural connection to that. But she doesn't really go out of her way to look for Marisol. It just kind of, she doesn't know where she is during the hurricane, and she seemingly moves on with her life. So one has to wonder why Mrs. Streeter even asks about Marisol if she doesn't really care. Or maybe Kenan is trying to talk about race relations in this community, particularly noting, how Black Americans might not have that much, but they definitely have more than immigrants. And Marisol is serving Mrs. Streeter in a lower class kind of manner, because she has less, and Mrs. Streeter has more money, comparatively more money. She's not necessarily the ruling class, but maybe she might be one of the more well-to-do people in this community. So maybe talking about the race relationship there, and how even though they are, both oppressed by the white hegemony, Mrs. Streeter isn't showing enough care or attention to the fact that her friend has gone missing, that someone who is somewhat connected to her family isn't going to be coming back. Or maybe she does care, and that's why she's thinking about her grandparents and whatnot, because Marisol is of the same caliber, same quality. It's a bit unclear, because I don't exactly know what Kenan is really trying to say in this particular short story, or really in this entire collection. It largely feels like he's just rambling on and on and on, maybe talking more of the idea of this area, this region in which he probably grew up, rather than having a specific point to make with any of this. What is he trying to impart upon the reader? I kind of have to meet Kenan more than halfway on many of these stories, which is unfortunate given the kind of stuff that he writes about normally. I feel like you could have a lot to say, especially with this particular short story, because it's about destruction and especially natural disasters in a minority community. You can have a lot to say, but again, Kenan doesn't really reach for anything here, and so it makes it one of the more weaker short stories that I've read for this channel. Anyway, those are my thoughts on God's Gonna Trouble the Water by Randall Kenan. Not a particularly good short story. I definitely recommend that you avoid it, as well as the larger book, If I Had Two Wings, because I think Kenan might have written better things in the past. He seems to have a lot of critical acclaim to it, although in some cases his work has been ignored. But if it's somewhat celebrated by others, that must mean that there's something to that. I don't get why this is kind of stale or whatnot, but maybe it's just one of the weaker things that he's written. So yeah, I don't recommend it to you out there. If you have something to say in my review, do so below. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that other people can find out about this short story or this book if they or this author if they don't already know. This might be of interest to them more so than it is to me. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and hurricane-like travels. Farewell.